Hello, I'm Shane. I've backpacked or paddled thousands of miles in the wilderness, and my mission is to bring you deeper into the wilderness with trip videos, educational content, and gear reviews. For this video, I've portaged and I've paddled and I've camped on the Kelso River in northern Minnesota. My mission in this video is to explain 10 features I consider most essential in a 3-season budget backcountry tent. The first feature I consider most essential in a 3-season budget backcountry tent is a full rainfly. Tents that work well in the budget category are what's called double-walled tents. What that means is that they consist of an inner body and an outer body. The inner body is the part of the tent that houses the campers. It's generally constructed of a light nylon material and some mesh material, and it is not waterproof, nor should it be. It needs to provide ventilation for the campers inside it. Rather, the thing that makes a budget backcountry tent waterproof is the rainfly, but for that to accomplish its job, it has to be a full rainfly, meaning that it has to extend across the entire inner tent, all the way around the perimeter of the inner tent to repel water from the inner tent and the campers and their gear inside that tent. That's a lesson that I learned the hard way on my very first backpacking trip ever. Not only was it my first backpacking trip, but it was also my first backcountry outfit. And although I had a little bit of money and I was able to buy a pretty nice backpack and a decent sleeping bag, everything else in my outfit was pretty much just total garbage. But probably the thing that was the worst was my tent. Really, it was like an inner body without any kind of substantial rainfly whatsoever. And my very first backpacking trip was in the Appalachian Mountains on a weekend that was going to get down into the 40s. But I hadn't really considered the fact that it was also going to rain for most of that weekend. So although it was dry when I first hiked into the backcountry, it didn't take long before it started to rain. And then once it was raining on the outside, it wasn't long before it was raining inside my tent also. The consequence was that everything inside that tent was utterly and completely and totally soaked, 100%. Most critically, my sleeping bag was soaked all the way from the foot box to the hood, everything in between. It was basically like sleeping inside a sopping wet sponge. And honestly, the only thing that saved me from hypothermia on that sub 50-degree night was the fact that I had a sleeping bag that was filled with synthetic insulation. So, if you've ever wondered if synthetic insulation in a sleeping bag is warm when wet, what I can tell you is that in fact it really is. But although it is warm when wet, it is anything but comfortable. If you can imagine falling asleep in a bathtub of lukewarm water and then waking up every 20 minutes, but it did save me from getting hypothermia, even if it was a terrible night's sleep. So I am appreciative of that fact. But I learned the lesson that any tent that you bring into the backcountry should be waterproof, and budget backcountry tents that are waterproof are double-walled and they have a full rainfly. The second feature I consider most essential in a 3-season budget backcountry tent is that rainfly have guy attachments on all sides so that it can be properly pitched out. And when I say it's properly pitched out, it means that the entire rainfly is taut. And a taut rainfly is a rainfly that repels water. It'll distribute the water around the tent rather than concentrating it in one place. And because it's taut, it'll help that water launch off of the rainfly and onto the water away from the tent. A loose rainfly doesn't allow that water to launch off of the fly, and so it falls straight down and then splashes back onto the internal side of the tent. That won't be a problem in a light rain, but in a heavy or prolonged rain, you'll have enough splashback that it'll start to dampen everything inside the tent. So my second most essential feature that I look for in a budget backcountry tent is that there are guyline attachments on the fly, allowing it to be fully taut and pitched well. The third feature I consider most essential in a budget backcountry tent is a vestibule. Now, a vestibule is basically a porch on a tent. And I'm surprised that not all tents have them, but many don't, even ones with decent rainflies. And so what a vestibule is it's a portion of the rainfly that is extended over the door. And what that does is that creates a space that's kind of outside the tent but still in a waterproof or dry place. And so it's a place that's both inside and outside. And a vestibule is just really nice so that when you open up the inside door of your tent, you're not immediately exposed to the weather. You've got a little bit of a buffer there. But also it's a great place to put things that you want to stay dry, but you don't want them to come inside the tent, like boots or shoes that have mud and leaves and pine needles and stuff on them that you don't want inside the tent. So the third most essential feature that I look for in a budget backcountry tent is a vestibule. The fourth feature I look for is aluminum poles. A lot of tents in the budget category will be constructed with fiberglass poles. And fiberglass poles, they're just heavy and they're fragile too. When they fail catastrophically. Aluminum poles, when they fail, they'll bend for a while before they completely splinter apart. But fiberglass poles, they'll splinter pretty fast, much faster than aluminum poles. So they're heavy and they're fragile. They're just not a great choice. They also get brittle when they get cold, another reason why they're not a great choice. My very first tent that I ever purchased was a disaster, but my second one lasted for 10 years. And I had that tent out for 60 days on a wilderness canoeing trip in Canada. And on the second night of that 60-day trip, my tent got hit square with a really, really strong headwind, and it collapsed the tent. And it bent one of the aluminum poles. If that had been a fiberglass pole, it probably would have broke. But because it was an aluminum pole, it just bent a little bit. And that tent was always misshapen for the rest of that trip, and probably for the next 5 years or so that I continued to use it before I got another tent. So the fourth feature I look for in a budget backcountry tent is I look for aluminum poles. The fifth feature that I look for is I look for what's called a clip design. And that just means that the inner body attaches to the poles with clips, as opposed to a sleeve design where you have to thread the poles through sleeves. That just takes a really long time. You can't see what's going on with your poles if they're properly fitted together. They get bunched up in there. If you try to back them out, the poles fall apart. It takes a long time. It's kind of a mess. It's more structurally sound, to be honest, than a clip dome style tent. In many cases, it's more structurally sound, which makes sense because the pole has more contact with the inner tent, and so the weight of the inner tent is distributed across more space. But clip designs are just easy, and for normal use, for non-4-season use, a clip design is perfectly sound. It's a perfect way to go. So that's the fifth feature I look for in a budget backcountry tent, and that is I look for a clip design. Now, if you're getting value from this video, if you would please kindly just hit that like button. And if you like videos like this, then go ahead and subscribe so that you don't miss any videos in the future. The sixth most essential feature is ventilation. And that's a feature of the internal body of the tent, the inner body of the tent. It should really be constructed of about 50% mesh material. And then it should also be constructed of a kind of lightweight nylon material. And what that material does is that material allows the tent to breathe. And it's a misconception that the only source of moisture for inside a tent is from outside. It also comes from inside, and it comes from you. It comes from the water vapor in your breath, and it comes from the water vapor that you emit when you sweat. And then if there's no way for that water vapor to get out, it condenses on the walls, and then it condenses all over everything inside the tent. And then when you wake up, you're just damp, and you're damp in your own bodily fluid, so it's kind of gross. And it's also, if it's really cold out, being just a little bit damp can really chill you. So that's the sixth most essential feature I look for in a budget backcountry tent is I look for good ventilation on that inner body. The seventh most essential feature I look for in a budget backcountry tent, spaciousness. And that's also a feature of the inner body. Really, it's a feature of the entire tent. So generally what I'm looking for is I'm looking for a tent that's rated for one more person than I intend to have sleep in that tent. So generally I bring out a 2-person tent when I'm sleeping as just a solo camper. But if I were to come out with a buddy, I would get a 3-season tent. And the reason for that is that backcountry tents are pretty small. They generally provide you with just enough space for a person to be able to lay down and sleep. And that becomes a little bit of a problem because then there's no space to, spread out a little bit, to be able to spread your clothes out or to be able to put your electronics or books or journals or whatever you're bringing with you. It just makes everything a little bit easier when you've got that additional space inside a tent. So that is the seventh most essential feature I look for in a budget backcountry tent, and that's spaciousness. Now, the eighth feature I look for in a budget backcountry tent is packability. You know, we're carrying these tents into the wilderness, into the backcountry on our backs. So they have to pack down to a pretty small size, and they have to be relatively lightweight. So in terms of size, I generally don't want anything that's going to be in a stuff sack that's more than about 8 inches wide and about 12 to 16 inches long, which isn't too hard to find. And in terms of weight, a budget backcountry tent should weigh probably 2 to 3 pounds per person that's going to be inside that tent, or that tent is rated for. So a 2-person tent should probably weigh between about 4 and 6 pounds, and a 3-person tent should weigh, probably no more than 7 or 8 pounds. And you really want to avoid any tents that weigh more than about 8 pounds if you're going to be hauling them into the backcountry. But there are 4-person tents out there that do weigh less than 8 pounds, or about 8 pounds. I mean, once you're in that budget backcountry category, then you're not going to find tents that really are more than 4-person. And anything that is 4-person, it won't be too hard to find something which is less than 8 pounds. So, I do want a tent that's going to be packable. Packs down and is relatively lightweight. And that is the 8th most essential feature I look for in a budget backcountry tent. The 9th most essential feature I look for in a budget backcountry tent is I want a tent that is freestanding, that you can set up with the poles and it'll stand up on its own, and all of its structure is provided by the poles. That is as opposed to non-freestanding tents that oftentimes their structure is provided from the ability to stake it out in various ways to create tension that will then hold up that inner body. And in the budget category, it's pretty common that companies, to save on expense and save on weight, they'll make tents non-freestanding. So you will find non-freestanding tents in the budget category. But I just prefer it to be freestanding. It's a lot more convenient. You have to have good stakeable ground for a non-freestanding tent, and you kind of have to have a large footprint because you got to stake it out in various directions. There's really an art to setting up a non-freestanding tent, and honestly, it's not an art that I've mastered or that I'm that interested in mastering at this point, just because where I camp, typically the bedrock is pretty close to the surface and there's not a lot of topsoil, so it's hard to find good stakeable ground under any conditions. But then, oftentimes if you're in the deep wilderness where there are no established campsites, it's kind of hard to find a place that has a good sized footprint that allows you to really stake out a non-freestanding tent. So I just prefer freestanding tents, and that's the 9th feature that I consider most essential when looking for a budget backcountry tent. The last feature is really a good return policy. When you're dealing with budget backcountry tents, sometimes you're going to come across a total stinker that just is that particular tent has been poorly produced. There's a manufacturing defect of some kind. So when you get your tent, you might have a defect, in which case you want a company that's just going to take it back and send you a replacement without really any questions, without charging you shipping, something which is easy. And then if you send it back and you get a second tent that is still defective in some way, then at that point it's probably just a bad company and you need to find another budget backcountry tent company to purchase from. But there are so many now, the competition is so fierce in this category that it's not impossible to find a good budget backcountry tent that you can get that will be free of manufacturing defects for easily less than $150. In fact, I've never spent more than $150 on a tent for all of the traveling I've done. Now, admittedly, I don't do a lot of 4-season winter camping where tents can become more expensive. And I don't do any alpine camping, really. And generally, I don't camp in places where my tent is going to be exposed to really strong winds for long periods of time. So I can get away with buying budget backcountry tents, but there's no reason that you should have to spend more than $150 to get a tent that works for 3 seasons and that works in about 90% of the situations that most backcountry travelers are going to find themselves in. And so I feel pretty confident that you should be able to get a good budget backcountry tent that is free of defects for less than $150. So my last, most essential feature is a good return policy, just in case there's some sort of defect in the manufacture of the tent. And it gives you a way out if it's just a stinker company and they're just putting out a lot of bad tents. So that's it. Those are the 10 features that I consider most essential in a budget backcountry tent. They are a full rain fly, guyline attachments to pitch that fly out properly, a vestibule, aluminum poles, a clip design, ventilation inside the tent, a spacious tent, a tent that is very packable, a tent that is freestanding, and a tent that's produced by a company with an easy return policy. And if you look under those 10 features, you should be able to find a pretty good tent for less than $150. Now, I have learned a whole lot about tents and gear since my very first backcountry trip where I got completely and totally rained out. And I hope this video helps beginning backcountry travelers avoid some of the same mistakes that I've made. And if you're a more experienced backcountry traveler, I hope that this video helps you get the best value for your budget tent dollar. Again, if you like this video, please like it. If you liked this video and you want to see more videos like it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you have anything to add, or if you just want to send me a shout out, go ahead and comment. That's all for now. I look forward to making the next video that will bring you deeper into the wilderness.